I called him Dad, until I found out he was my uncle. I grew up thinking my family's story was simple: a quiet dad, a protective mom, a house full of rules that were never explained. My father never talked about his childhood, never showed photos from before I was born. Whenever I asked about grandparents, he'd say they were gone and change the subject. I assumed he was just private. Lots of parents are. But there were things that never quite fit. He never signed school forms, never came to parent-teacher nights. He stood a step back in family photos like he didn't belong in the frame. And when people joked that I looked just like him, he'd smile, but his eyes would drop, like he was bracing for something. The truth started leaking out the year I turned 18. I needed my birth certificate for college. My mom told me it was in a locked drawer. She hovered while I searched, her hands shaking, correcting me when I got too close to the wrong folder. That's when I found a document that wasn't mine. Same last name, same address, different father listed. Not the man who raised me, a brother. When I confronted my mom, she didn't deny it. She just sat down like her legs finally gave out. She told me the man I called Dad was never supposed to be that. He stepped in because the real father couldn't, because it would have destroyed the family, because it was easier this way. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. He's not your father. He's your uncle. I laughed. I told her that didn't make sense until I realized the man standing in the hallway, listening, was already crying. And then he said my name, not the one they gave me, the one I was born with, and asked if I was ready to know who my real father actually is. I didn't sleep after that. Once the sentence landed in my chest, everything in the house changed shape. The hallway felt longer. The air felt watched. The pictures on the wall stopped being memories and started being evidence. My mother's silence wasn't protection anymore. It was a sealed door. I kept thinking about the name he used for me, the one I was born with. It didn't feel like mine at first. It felt like a tag on an old file, something that had been stored away and mislabeled on purpose. But the way he broke when he said it told me it was real. It was the first time I'd ever seen him lose control of his face. The man who lived a step behind the frame finally stepped forward, and he looked like he'd been standing at the edge of a cliff for 18 years. I didn't let myself cry yet. Crying felt like it would waste time. I went back to that locked drawer as soon as I could, while my mother sat too still at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. I didn't ask permission. I didn't ask for explanations. I just took every document that looked like it belonged to the story I'd been fed. Certificates, old insurance cards, folded letters, a small stack of papers, clipped together like someone had tried to keep the truth organized without ever letting it breathe. A second birth certificate, a name crossed out, a hospital bracelet in a plastic sleeve, a court-stamped form that didn't say adoption but carried the same weight. And beneath it all, like the thing everything else was built on, there was a death certificate. The name on it hit me harder than any sentence could have, because I recognized it. Not from family stories, from almost stories, from the way my mother used to stop herself mid-thought when certain topics came up, from the way my uncle, my fake dad, the man I'd called Dad, never let me wander too far from the house as a kid like the world outside had teeth. It was my real father, and according to that certificate, he'd been dead for years. My brain tried to protect me with easy answers first. Accident, illness, something tragic and ordinary. The kind of death that makes families huddle closer and never speak the name because it hurts. But then I saw the manner of death, and the room went quiet in a way that felt wrong. I didn't read it twice because I wanted to be sure. I read it twice because my eyes refused to accept it the first time. Homicide. The words sat there like a stain. My stomach flipped. My hands went cold and clumsy, like my body was trying to drop the paper before it could infect me. For a long moment, I couldn't even remember how to breathe normally. All I could do was stare at that single printed fact and feel my entire life rearranging itself around it. Homicide didn't just mean my father was dead. It meant someone chose it. And then I thought about the man in the hallway, crying without making a sound. I thought about his distance, his refusal to sign anything, his constant hovering presence without the rights of a parent. I thought about how he never corrected people when they called him my father, but never claimed it either. like he didn't deserve the title, like he'd borrowed a role and it burned. And suddenly, the question that had felt like the final twist became the first step. If my real father was murdered, why were we still living in the same house with the same last name, pretending like the past was simply gone? I didn't need to ask out loud what my mind was already screaming. I already knew where the story was going. I turned toward the kitchen. My mother looked up at me, and whatever she saw in my face made her shoulders fold inward, like she was bracing for impact. The man I'd called Dad stood in the doorway again, not trying to hide this time. His eyes were swollen, his jaw tight, like he'd been grinding down words for years and finally had nothing left to chew. I didn't speak, not because I didn't want to, because if I did, I knew it would come out as something sharp enough to cut through the whole room. I held up the death certificate. Their faces did the rest. My mother didn't faint, she didn't scream, she didn't deny it. She just closed her eyes, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it pressed my feet into the floor. He moved like he was about to step forward, then stopped himself. That old habit, always a step back, always not allowed. And then, without any dramatic confession, without any grand moment, the truth arrived the way it had always lived in our home, in fragments, in broken pieces forced into the light. I learned that my real father had been my uncle's brother. Not just biologically, actually. They grew up under the same roof. They carried the same features, the same last name, the same shadowed childhood they never talked about. And whatever happened between them started long before I existed. My mother met the wrong one first. She fell in love with the one who smiled easy and promised calm, the one who made her feel safe, the one who, according to her, wanted a life that looked normal from the outside. And then the other brother, the one who became my father, pulled her into something hotter and messier. A relationship that didn't fit the rules my mother was raised on, a love that wasn't neat, a love that didn't stay quiet. When she got pregnant, it split the house open because my uncle had been there the whole time, watching, wanting, resenting. And when my father refused to disappear, when he refused to step aside and let the family pretend nothing had happened, the situation turned from shame into war. My mother tried to paint it like it was all choices and pressure, like everyone was trapped by tradition and fear. But the paperwork didn't say tradition, it said homicide. So I sat there, still not speaking, and listened to the sounds of their breathing, their movements, their pauses, their inability to look at me for long. I watched my uncle's hands shake when he reached for the edge of the counter. I watched him swallow like he was forcing something down that kept rising up. And then the final truth came, not in words, but in what my mother finally couldn't stop showing. Fear, not grief, not shame, fear of him. That's when I understood the real shape of my childhood. Those rules weren't random, they were containment. Don't tell anyone too much, don't ask too many questions, don't bring strangers into the house, don't talk about family, don't post old photos, don't dig. It wasn't to protect me from the world, it was to protect the story from the truth. The next pieces came over the following hours through more documents, through old police paperwork that had been folded and hidden, through a dusty storage bin I didn't even know existed. The kind of bin that only exists for secrets. There had been an investigation. Of course there had. Homicide doesn't vanish just because a family wants it to. But the case went cold fast, and every detail about why felt like a lesson in how easily some people can slip through consequences when the right people decide to look away. My uncle had an alibi. My uncle had witnesses. My uncle had a version of events that sounded clean. My uncle had played the role of grieving brother so convincingly that even the police notes described him as cooperative, broken, devastated, and my mother had been the perfect accessory to his lie. Not because she wanted my father dead, but because she was scared of what would happen if she told the truth. I learned that the night my father died wasn't a random act. It was an argument that escalated, a confrontation, a final fight that ended outside the public eye, something that could have been stopped if fear didn't keep people silent. My uncle had told my mother afterward that it was an accident, that it was self-defense, that his brother came at him first, that he had no choice, that if she spoke, I would grow up without a father anyway, because he'd be locked away, and then what would happen to her? What would happen to me? And my mother drowning in panic and shame and survival, took the deal. She helped rebuild the story. She erased my name and replaced it with one that fit. She kept us in the house because leaving would draw questions. She let my uncle become my father on paper in every way that mattered, without ever having the nerve to let him claim it openly. Because a man who needs to hide his role is easier to control. A man who needs your silence will always try to keep you close. So she kept him close, and she kept me closer. I stared at my uncle as the weight of it settled into my bones. I looked at the man I'd loved, the man who fixed my bike chain, the man who waited up late when I was sick even though he never knew how to comfort me the way my mother did, the man who stood in the doorway of every childhood memory like a guard. And I realized the reason his eyes always dropped when people said, I looked like him. He wasn't bracing for a joke, he was bracing for a crime. For the first time in my life, I saw his love for me clearly, and it didn't comfort me. It terrified me because it wasn't pure, it wasn't clean. It was tangled up with guilt and ownership and the kind of devotion that can look like protection until you realize it's also possession. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I did the only thing I could do that didn't require my voice. I left. I walked out of the house without telling them where I was going because I didn't trust my own family with my location anymore. The air outside felt too bright, too ordinary for what I'd just learned. Cars moved, people laughed. Life went on like my world hadn't cracked in half. I went somewhere public, somewhere with cameras, somewhere safe. And then I did what no one in my house had ever done. I told the truth to someone outside it. I went to the police, not to ask if they could reopen the case politely, not to wonder aloud about old mistakes. I went with documents, I went with names, I went with the birth certificate that didn't match the life I lived. I went with the death certificate that proved a homicide. I went with the old paperwork my mother thought no one would ever see again. I went with enough proof to make ignoring me harder than listening. It wasn't dramatic. It was long. It was paperwork and waiting rooms and an officer's face changing as he read the same words I read. And this time, the story didn't get to stay in my family. This time, it became a case again. Over the next weeks, the world I knew dissolved into interviews, phone calls, evidence reviews, and the slow, grinding reality of how hard it is to prove the truth when the lie has had years to settle in. But lies leave fingerprints. Someone remembered something they'd been too afraid to say back then. Someone else admitted that an alibi had been rehearsed, a timeline shifted, a witness cracked, records that had been misplaced surfaced in archives. My mother tried to reach out. My uncle tried too. He showed up places he shouldn't have been able to find me. That was when I finally understood the difference between a father who loves you and a man who thinks you belong to him. I filed for a protection order. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it because my childhood had been built inside his cage, and I refused to live in it as an adult. When the arrest finally happened, it wasn't cinematic. It wasn't the kind of moment movies prepare you for. It was a knock on a door. It was handcuffs. It was neighbors staring. It was my mother collapsing into sobs that sounded more like relief than grief. And it was my uncle, my fake dad, looking at everyone like he couldn't believe the world finally stopped playing along. The trial was worse than the arrest, because trials aren't just about justice. They're about details, the kind of details that turn your stomach and steal your sleep, the kind of details that force you to hear your father's name spoken over and over, like it's a point in an argument, instead of a person who should still be alive. I sat through it anyway, not because I wanted pain, because I wanted the truth to be spoken in a place that couldn't be locked in a drawer. I heard how my uncle tried to explain it, how he tried to frame himself as cornered, how he painted my father as unstable, how he leaned on every old family wound to make his choices sound inevitable. But the evidence didn't care about his story. The evidence cared about what happened, and what happened was simple. Even when everyone spent years trying to make it complicated, he killed him, and then he raised me, and called it love. When the verdict came, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter and stranger. I felt the end of a long lie. I felt grief for the father I never got to know, the one whose face I'd never seen in photos because my mother had erased him to keep the peace. I felt anger for the childhood that was engineered to keep me obedient, for the rules that were really walls. And I felt a kind of hollow pity for my mother, who had convinced herself survival was the same as safety. After it was over, I did something I'd been denied my whole life. I went looking for my father as a person, not as a secret. I found his remaining family, people my mother cut off to keep the story clean. I found a box of photos that should have been in my home but never were. I found a laugh that looked like mine, a tilt of the head I recognized in the mirror, a history that didn't feel like a locked drawer, just a life. I visited his grave. I brought flowers, but I also brought the thing that mattered more, his name. I said it there, quietly, without fear that someone would punish me for it. And in that moment, I understood something that made my chest ache. My real father had been dead for years, but the truth about him had been alive the whole time, waiting for me to stop believing the version of my family that was easiest. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't try to rebuild with my mother like nothing happened. Because some families don't need to be repaired, some need to be escaped. I kept the name they gave me for paperwork, for simplicity, for the life I'd already built. But I also kept the name I was born with, not as a replacement, but as a reclaiming. A piece of myself that had been stolen before I could even understand what theft was. My uncle went to prison. My mother went to therapy, to court, to a life where she had to finally live with what she chose. She wrote letters, she apologized, she begged, she tried to explain. I read them once, and then I put them away. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because it has to be earned in more than words. And me, I left the quiet house full of rules behind. I went to college like I planned, but I went as someone else entirely. Not because I changed, because I finally learned who I'd been the whole time. A daughter who survived a story built on a murder. A daughter who broke it open, and a daughter who refused to let the dead stay buried just because the living were afraid.